A resourceful single mother, Sarah, is hired as a housekeeper for the wealthy and enigmatic Lawson family, where she meets Ethan, the socially withdrawn son of influential entrepreneur Henry Lawson. As Sarah's warmth breaks through Ethan's walls, they form a meaningful bond, but their growing connection stirs deep-seated tensions within the Lawson household. Henry, torn between protectiveness and suspicion, tries to intervene, leading to a cascade of events. The small apartment was a patchwork of second-hand furniture, scattered toys, and faint sunlight streaming through cracked blinds. This was home for Sarah and her son Max. At 29, Sarah had faced more hardship than she cared to admit, but her spirit remained unbroken. Her life revolved around Max, a lively 5-year-old with bright eyes and a quick smile that belied their struggles. Sarah's days were a delicate balance of working multiple part-time jobs, navigating childcare, and keeping a brave face for her son. Max's boundless energy and love for stories about brave knights and daring explorers kept them afloat. He was too young to understand why their meals sometimes came from food banks or why Sarah's clothes were patched and worn. For him, his mother was a hero who made up grand bedtime stories and sang silly songs. One morning, as Sarah spread peanut butter on the last slices of bread, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, but its contents were anything but ordinary. A job offer. She had applied for every position she could find, but this one stood out. The job was as a housekeeper for an influential entrepreneur named Henry Lawson, a name Sarah only recognized from the business sections of the newspapers she sometimes borrowed from cafes. The opportunity was daunting and exhilarating. The salary promised stability she hadn't dared dream about, and perhaps a chance for Max to have more than the basics. But the Lawsons lived in a world that felt alien, a mansion with polished marble floors, art-filled hallways, and lives cushioned by wealth. After a tense interview, during which she tried to downplay her nerves and emphasize her experience managing chaos with grace, Sarah received the job. Relief surged through her as she signed the contract, though doubt lingered. She would be stepping into a world so different from her own. But for Max, Sarah was willing to face any challenge. On her first day, she dressed in her best, an outfit meticulously pressed but undeniably humble. Max clung to her leg, eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of fear. Sarah knelt down, kissed his forehead, and promised she would be back soon. As she walked through the grand gates of the Lawson estate, the contrast to her cramped apartment was stark. The air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers from an immaculate garden that stretched on endlessly. Inside, everything was polished to perfection, quiet but for the faint ticking of an antique clock. It was here that Sarah would meet not just the challenges of keeping the sprawling mansion pristine, but also confront the tangled dynamics of the Lawson family. The job would demand much of her, but it also carried possibilities she could scarcely imagine. This was a turning point in her life. Sarah just didn't know it yet. In a place of affluence, secrets often hid in the shadows, and trust was hard-earned. The days ahead would bring trials of the heart and the soul. The vast expanse of the Lawson estate felt overwhelming as Sarah stepped into the marble-floored entry hall for her first day. She took a deep breath, holding her bag tightly to keep her hands from trembling. A grand staircase spiraled upwards, and sunlight filtered in through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the polished surfaces. Everything was immaculate, pristine, and utterly foreign to her. Mrs. Calloway, the estate's head housekeeper, approached, her gaze sharp but not unkind. She was a thin, severe-looking woman with iron-gray hair pulled tightly into a bun, exuding the air of someone who expected rules to be followed to the letter. Sarah stood up straighter, nodding respectfully as introductions were made. "Follow me, Miss Carter," Mrs. Calloway said, wasting no time on pleasantries. "There's much to learn." The morning was spent acquainting Sarah with her duties, managing linens, cleaning specific rooms, and respecting the privacy of the Lawsons. "You will not enter certain areas unless explicitly instructed," Mrs. Calloway emphasized, her eyes narrowing meaningfully. "That includes the private quarters of Mr. Lawson's son, Ethan." Sarah nodded obediently, but couldn't shake the curiosity sparked by Mrs. Calloway's stern warning. She quickly learned that Ethan was a reclusive figure in the household, rarely seen by staff, if at all. Whispers among the other workers painted a picture of a young man trapped within himself, existing in shadows even in this sunlit mansion. During a quiet moment, while dusting shelves filled with books older than her grandparents, Sarah's attention was drawn to a muffled noise, an oddly rhythmic tapping. She followed the sound down a long corridor, pausing outside a slightly ajar door. The room was dimly lit, filled with the scent of old parchment and something faintly metallic. Curiosity won out over caution, and Sarah pushed the door open. Sitting at a desk cluttered with intricate mechanical parts and a scattering of papers was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s. His dark hair fell over his forehead as he focused intently on the gears he was piecing together. This, she realized, was Ethan Lawson, the enigmatic son. He hadn't noticed her yet, absorbed in his work, but the room's atmosphere shifted the moment she stepped inside. Ethan glanced up, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. His eyes were a deep, stormy gray, and they lingered on Sarah as if trying to determine whether she posed a threat. "I am sorry," Sarah stammered, stepping back immediately. "I didn't mean to intrude." Ethan's fingers froze mid-motion, and for a moment, silence stretched uncomfortably. Then he spoke, his voice soft and flat, like a distant echo. "Most people knock. I'm new here." Sarah felt the weight of his scrutiny and knew she was breaking rules just by being in the room. She bowed her head. "I'll leave." Ethan studied her for another beat before returning to his work, as if their brief exchange hadn't happened. "What's your name?" he asked abruptly, without looking up. "Sarah," she replied, hesitantly taking a step closer instead of retreating. "I'm the new housekeeper." A pause hung in the air, and then Ethan nodded, more to himself than to her. "Nice to meet you, Sarah." His tone was distant, but something about his demeanor, the isolation in his eyes, the hesitancy in his words, made her linger in the doorway a moment longer. Before she could say anything more, a voice called out from down the hall. It was Mrs. Calloway, and the urgency in her tone suggested she would not be pleased to find Sarah here. Reluctantly, she backed away, offering Ethan a small nod before slipping out and hurrying to meet Mrs. Calloway. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself crossing paths with Ethan more often. She noticed small things: his tendency to disappear into books or mechanical projects, the way he shied away from interactions, even with the staff. He moved like a ghost in his own home, present but disconnected. Something about it troubled her, and despite her own difficult life, she felt a pang of empathy. Ethan seemed burdened by something heavy and unseen. One afternoon, as Sarah cleaned an empty parlor, a soft thud drew her attention. She turned to find Ethan in the doorway, awkwardly shifting from foot to foot. He looked out of place, as if he wasn't sure why he was there, or what he wanted to say. After a beat of silence, he walked over and handed her a small mechanical bird, delicately crafted, with intricate wings that moved when touched. It's broken," he said, avoiding her gaze. "I thought you might like it." Sarah's breath caught. The gesture, though small, was filled with unspoken weight. She took the bird carefully, feeling the cool metal and the fragile intention behind the gift. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice gentle. Ethan's lips twitched, almost forming a smile before he retreated once more. Sarah watched him go, feeling something shift inside her, a sense that beneath Ethan's layers of isolation lay a heart-craving connection. And so, a fragile thread of understanding formed between them. In this grand mansion, where wealth hid pain and every room seemed to echo with secrets, Sarah's presence began to light corners that had long been darkened. The sun was setting over the sprawling grounds of the Lawson estate, bathing everything in a soft orange glow. Sarah's day had been long, cleaning endless rooms, washing fine linens, and handling small crises in the household. But the thought of returning home to Max kept her going. As she folded a last stack of sheets, a familiar metallic clink caught her attention. Ethan was at it again, tinkering in his workshop, a small room tucked away in the eastern wing of the mansion. Over the past few weeks, Sarah had come to recognize these sounds as a peculiar comfort. Ethan worked late into the night, always on some project, reassembling broken watches, crafting tiny gears, or building models. Despite Mrs. Calloway's insistence that Sarah keep her distance, she had grown curious about Ethan's world. More than that, she felt a pull toward the young man who seemed so alone, even in a house full of people. That evening, as she passed by the slightly ajar door of his workshop, Ethan's voice surprised her. "You can come in?" His words were hesitant, but there was a softness to them, a hint of invitation. Sarah stepped inside, trying not to let her nerves show. Ethan was hunched over a workbench strewn with tools and parts. An intricate clock lay before him, its inner workings exposed like a fragile puzzle. "I don't want to disturb you," she said quietly. "You're not," Ethan replied, eyes focused on his task. He paused, picking up a tiny gear and examining it closely. "I'm used to being alone. It's different when you're here." There was a vulnerability in his voice that caught Sarah off guard. She took a step closer, peering at the scattered pieces on the table. "What are you making?" Ethan glanced at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, as if no one had ever asked before. "A clock," he said simply. "I found it in the attic. It belonged to my mother." Sarah's heart ached at the wistfulness in his tone. She wanted to ask more, but sensed that probing too deeply would push him away. Instead, she picked up a small cog and turned it over in her hand. "It's beautiful work," she said sincerely. "Thanks," Ethan muttered, his fingers moving deftly as he resumed his repairs. Silence fell between them, but it wasn't awkward. It felt natural. For the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel like a ghost in his own home. He felt seen. Over the following days, their interactions became more frequent. Sarah would bring Ethan tea during her rounds, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Ethan began to wait for her visits, though he would never admit it. They spoke about small things at first: favorite books, the changing weather, Max's latest mischievous antics. Ethan listened quietly, and sometimes Sarah could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips when she recounted one of Max's stories. One rainy afternoon, Sarah found Ethan sitting in the library, lost in thought. His shoulders were tense, and there was a weariness about him that spoke of battles fought and lost. She sat down across from him without asking permission. "You look like you need a distraction," she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. Ethan's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Is that what you're here for? To distract me?" "No," Sarah replied softly. "I'm here because I care." For a moment, Ethan's mask slipped. His eyes met hers, raw and unguarded. "Why?" he whispered. "Because no one should have to feel alone," she said simply. "I know what that's like." Ethan's hands clenched, and he looked away, blinking rapidly. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "My mother died when I was a child. My father? He tried to fill the void, but it was never the same. He's always been distant." Sarah listened quietly, sensing that these were words Ethan had rarely spoken aloud. She thought of Max, of how fiercely she loved him despite their struggles. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Sometimes I think he blames me," Ethan continued, bitterness creeping into his tone. "Or maybe I blame myself." "None of this was your fault," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You were just a child." Ethan stared at her, as if weighing her words. Then he nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said, "but it doesn't change the past." They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence, one born of understanding and shared pain. In the days that followed, their bond deepened. Sarah's warmth chipped away at Ethan's walls, and he found himself laughing at her stories, sharing pieces of himself he kept hidden for so long. She taught him how to make simple meals, and he showed her how to repair broken things: watches, toys, small machines. Each moment was a small step toward healing. But not everyone approved of their growing friendship. Henry Lawson, ever vigilant, began to notice the change in his son. Ethan, who had once been sullen and withdrawn, was coming alive again, and Sarah was at the center of it. Henry watched from the shadows, his emotions a mix of hope, suspicion, and something darker. He couldn't afford to be careless where Ethan was concerned. Sarah, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the weight of what she had taken on. She wanted to help Ethan, to be his friend, but she knew that their connection, no matter how genuine, could come at a cost. In a place like the Lawson estate, nothing stayed hidden for long. Henry Lawson stood at the window of his study, hands clasped tightly behind his back. From this vantage point, he could see much of the estate. The meticulously groomed gardens, the sun-dappled paths, and at this moment, his son walking beside Sarah. They were just specks in the distance. But even from here, Henry could tell that Ethan was more animated than he had been in years. He watched as Ethan gestured, his hands moving as he spoke, while Sarah listened, her expression warm and encouraging. It should have brought him relief, seeing his son emerge from the shell of silence and self-imposed isolation. Instead, it filled him with a gnawing unease. Henry turned away from the window, his jaw clenched. The polished wooden floors of the study creaked beneath his measured steps. A part of him wanted to be grateful. Ethan was coming back to life. But another part, a darker and more protective part, saw only danger. Sarah Carter was an outsider, a housekeeper, someone who should have stayed on the periphery of their lives. Instead, she was crossing boundaries Henry wasn't sure she even understood. "She's good for him," came the voice of Mrs. Calloway from the doorway. She had entered quietly, as was her custom. Henry hadn't heard her approach, but he wasn't surprised. The older woman had been with the family long enough to speak freely, within reason. "I'm aware," Henry replied tersely. He poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter on the side table. The amber liquid swirled as he lifted the glass to his lips, but didn't drink. Too good, perhaps. Mrs. Calloway stepped forward, her expression carefully neutral. "Forgive me, sir, but is that such a terrible thing? Ethan has been distant for so long." Henry's grip on the glass tightened. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't tried?" The bitterness in his voice startled even himself. He took a breath, attempting to rein in his emotions. "I've done everything I could." Mrs. Calloway inclined her head respectfully. "Of course, sir, but sometimes it takes more than what we can give. It takes someone willing to see him, not just the heir to the Lawson name." Henry said nothing. He stared at the liquor, the reflection of the room warping in its depths. He had spent years trying to bridge the gap between him and his son. Years filled with therapists, tutors, and grand gestures that Ethan rejected or ignored. Ethan's grief over his mother's death had been like a chasm, and Henry had tried to fill it with structure, discipline, and eventually distance. Now, a woman with no connection to their world, a woman with no right in his mind to be anything more than an employee, had walked in and done what he could not. "She doesn't know what she's dealing with," Henry said finally, his voice low. "Ethan is fragile. He's also stronger than you think, sir," Mrs. Calloway countered gently. "Maybe she sees that too." Henry turned away, his shoulders stiff. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him feared Mrs. Calloway was right. Maybe he had underestimated Ethan's resilience. Maybe, in his attempts to protect his son, he had smothered him. But there was something else, something Henry couldn't shake. Trust was a dangerous commodity. He had seen people wear masks before, using kindness as a means to an end. What did he really know about Sarah Carter? She claimed to care for Ethan, but what if there was more? What if her motives weren't as pure as they appeared? Determined to find answers, Henry called for a private investigator that same evening. Discretion was key. If Sarah posed any threat to his son's fragile stability, he would know. He owed Ethan that much. But until the results came in, Henry would watch, waiting for any sign that Sarah might slip up. Unaware of the scrutiny she was under, Sarah continued to navigate the strange waters of her new life. Her days were filled with cleaning, organizing, and moments with Ethan. They developed small routines, morning tea together when she could steal a few minutes, evenings where she helped him sort through the attic's forgotten relics. It was during these moments that Ethan shared stories about his mother, recalling fragments of a happier time. He described her laugh, her love for old books, and the way she had nurtured his fascination with machines. When he spoke of her, his eyes softened, but there was always a shadow lurking, a reminder of the emptiness her absence left. One evening, as they sat in the dim light of a flickering lantern, Ethan handed Sarah a delicate music box. "It was hers," he said quietly. "She used to wind it up before bed. The melody. It's the only thing I remember clearly. Sarah cradled the music box gently, as if it might shatter. Would you like to hear it? Ethan nodded, a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. She turned the key slowly, and the soft, melancholic tune began to play. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, and when it ended, a single tear traced its way down his cheek. Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, and for once, he didn't flinch away. From the shadows, Henry watched. He had been passing through the hallway when he heard the music and was drawn to it, like a ghost haunting old memories. Seeing his son open up was both a relief and a torment. It made him question everything, his choices, his failures, and whether his suspicion of Sarah was justified. Perhaps she truly did care for Ethan, but could he afford to take that chance? Henry's instincts, honed by years of business dealings and betrayals, whispered that trust could be a dangerous gift. The following day, Henry's emotions boiled over. He found Sarah cleaning the parlor and stepped inside, his presence filling the room. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone cold and precise. "A word, if you please." Sarah set down her duster, sensing the shift in the air. She nodded cautiously. "Of course, Mr. Lawson." He gestured for her to sit, but remained standing himself, looming over her. "You've been spending a great deal of time with my son?" "I have," Sarah admitted, keeping her voice even. "He asked for my company. I only want to help." "Help?" Henry's eyes narrowed. "Be careful, Miss Carter. My son has been through enough. If you have any ulterior motives, any intentions beyond what you claim, I will know." The accusation stung, but Sarah met his gaze without wavering. "I don't want anything from you or Ethan," she said firmly. "I care about him. That's all." Henry studied her for a long moment, searching for cracks in her sincerity. Finally, he stepped back. "Be sure that's true," he said, his voice like steel. "Because if it isn't, you won't like the consequences." With that, he turned and left, leaving Sarah shaken but resolute. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't abandon Ethan. She had come too far, and so had he. The days passed with a palpable tension settling over the Lawson estate. Sarah continued to care for her responsibilities, but she could feel Henry's eyes on her, cold and watchful. Their confrontation left her unsettled, but her commitment to Ethan remained unwavering. She avoided Henry as much as possible, focusing on the tasks at hand and the fragile bond she had built with Ethan. Ethan sensed the change too. He wasn't oblivious to the subtle shifts, the tightened smiles of the staff, the quiet, urgent conversations behind closed doors. More than once, he caught glimpses of his father watching from afar, as if waiting for something to crack. Ethan felt trapped in a game he didn't understand, with Sarah caught in the middle. One rainy evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Ethan appeared at the entrance to the kitchen where Sarah was cleaning. His usually pale face was flushed, and his eyes were clouded with frustration. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice strained. Sarah dried her hands and nodded, following him into the dimly lit hallway. They walked in silence until they reached the small and used sitting room where they often talked in private. Ethan closed the door behind them, his movements tense. He turned to face her, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked gently. Ethan shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Everything. My father, the way he's been acting. It's because of us, isn't it?" Sarah's heart sank. She had been hoping to shield Ethan from the worst of Henry's suspicion, but there was no point in lying. "Yes," she admitted. He thinks I'm using you somehow. That I have ulterior motives." "Ulterior motives?" Ethan repeated bitterly, his hands balling into fists. "He doesn't even know you. He's worried about you," Sarah said carefully. "He's protective." "Protective?" Ethan's voice rose. "Is that what you call it? All he's ever done is protect me from myself. He doesn't trust me to make my own choices, to have a life." He paused, his breath coming fast. "You're the only one who treats me like a person, Sarah. I don't want to lose that." "You won't," Sarah promised. But even as she said the words, she felt a chill of uncertainty. There was a storm brewing, and she wasn't sure how to stop it. The storm broke the next day. Sarah was scrubbing the marble floors when Henry's voice cut through the quiet like a knife. "Miss Carter, my study." "Now." She rose slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward her. The staff exchanged wary glances as Sarah followed Henry down the hall. The walk felt longer than it should have, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. When they reached the study, Henry closed the door firmly behind her. "Sit," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. Sarah obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. Henry remained standing, his expression unreadable. "I've had you looked into," he began, and Sarah's stomach clenched. "Your past, your finances, everything. I know you're struggling, that you're a single mother trying to make ends meet." He leaned in closer, his voice softening just enough to make it sting. "I understand desperation, Miss Carter. I know how it can lead people to take advantage of opportunities." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I've never hidden who I am," she said evenly. "And I'm not taking advantage of Ethan." "Then what is it?" Henry demanded, his voice rising. "What do you want from him? Money? Influence? Sympathy?" "None of that." Sarah stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I care about Ethan. That's all." Henry's eyes flashed with something unreadable. Pain, perhaps, or the remnants of fear. "Caring isn't enough. Not for him. You can't fix him with your kindness, Miss Carter. He needs stability, not someone who'll leave when things get difficult." "I'm not leaving," Sarah shot back, anger rising. "I'm not the one who's been keeping him in a cage, pretending it's protection." Henry's face darkened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might shout. Instead, he took a deep breath, his voice cold and controlled. "I can't allow this to continue. You've overstepped your role. You will pack your things and leave this estate today." The finality of his words hit Sarah like a blow. "What about Ethan?" she whispered. "You can't just shut me out of his life." "Ethan is my son," Henry said, his tone hardening. "He is my responsibility, and I will not let you interfere any longer." Tears burned in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "He needs someone who believes in him. And you believe you're that person?" Henry scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself." Sarah turned and left without another word. She walked through the mansion, her steps echoing in the empty corridors. Every memory of her time there, Ethan's hesitant smiles, their shared conversations, felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She gathered her belongings quickly, numb to the curious and sympathetic glances of the other staff. As she walked out the grand doors for the last time, the weight of her departure sank in. But the hardest part came when Ethan found out. He burst into her small quarters just as she was about to leave, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "You're leaving?" "Ethan," she began, her voice thick. "I have no choice." "No," he shook his head, his fists trembling. "You can't go. You promised." "I'm sorry." Sarah stepped forward, her heart aching. "I tried." "Don't go," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please." But there was nothing she could do. Henry had made his decision, and for now, it was final. Sarah hugged Ethan tightly, feeling his desperation, his fear of being abandoned all over again. "I'm so sorry," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. Ethan pulled away abruptly, his expression hardening. "I'll find you," he said, his voice raw with pain. "No matter what, I'll find you." Before she could respond, he turned and ran. Sarah watched him go, feeling the pieces of her heart break for him. As she left the estate, she knew this wasn't the end. But whatever came next, it would be darker and more difficult than either of them could imagine. The days after Sarah's departure were a blur of emptiness for Ethan. The mansion, already a place of isolation, felt suffocating. Rooms that once held the comfort of shared conversations now seemed cold and hollow. Ethan drifted through the halls, a ghost among the living. He avoided the staff, ignored his father, and retreated to his workshop, where remnants of old projects mocked him with memories he wasn't ready to face. Henry noticed the change immediately. He had expected anger or perhaps defiance from Ethan, but instead, his son had simply withdrawn, sinking into a silence that was all too familiar. It was the silence of loss, the same dark void that had consumed Ethan after his mother's death. Henry's attempts to reach out were met with blank stares or doors shut in his face. The regret that had been gnawing at him since the day he forced Sarah out now threatened to consume him whole. One evening, Henry stood outside Ethan's door, his hand raised to knock. He hesitated, hearing nothing from the other side. A memory surged, a younger Ethan, sobbing quietly in this same room, shutting out the world. Henry lowered his hand. How many times had he stood here before, unsure of how to help? How many times had he walked away? This time, he lingered a moment longer, whispering, "I'm sorry, son." But the door remained closed, and the apology hung in the air, unheard. Inside, Ethan stared at the gears and wires scattered across his workbench, unable to focus. He picked up the small mechanical bird he had once given Sarah. It felt cold and lifeless in his hands, a cruel reflection of how he felt. Anger surged within him, sudden and overwhelming. With a yell, he hurled the bird across the room, shattering it against the wall. Pieces clattered to the floor, and Ethan sank to his knees, trembling. Desperation clawed at him. He needed to see her, to hear her voice. She had been the first person to make him feel human. The thought of losing that terrified him. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed his coat and stumbled out of his room. Rain lashed against the mansion's windows as he slipped out into the stormy night, ignoring the calls of the staff who saw him leave. He didn't care where he was going. He just needed to escape, to find her. The wind howled as he drove, the rain blurring his vision. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. He had no plan, no idea where to start looking for Sarah. All he had was a desperate need to see her, to tell her that he wasn't ready to give up. But the storm grew worse, and the roads were slick with rain. His heart pounded, matching the rhythm of the rain pelting against the windshield. And then, in an instant, everything changed. Headlights appeared suddenly in the opposite lane, veering dangerously close. Ethan swerved, tires skidding on the wet pavement. The world tilted, metal screeched, and the impact sent his car careening off the road. Everything went dark. Henry was pacing when the call came. The words were distant at first: accident, hospital, critical condition. But they landed like a physical blow. He dropped the phone, his mind struggling to process the reality. His son was fighting for his life. The drive to the hospital was a blur, rain streaking across the windshield like tears. When he arrived, he barely heard the doctor's explanations. Head trauma, broken bones, internal injuries. None of it felt real. Hours passed in agonizing limbo. Henry sat in a sterile waiting room, his head in his hands. He thought of every moment he had failed Ethan, every cold word, every time he let his own fears dictate his actions. "Please," he whispered to no one, to the universe, to whatever might be listening. "Please, let him live." News of the accident reached Sarah quickly. She was sitting on the edge of Max's bed, reading him a story when the phone rang. The voice on the other end, one of the Lawson staff who had always been kind to her, told her what happened. Sarah's heart stopped. Ethan was in the hospital, critical condition. She didn't hesitate. Gathering Max and a few essentials, she hurried to the hospital. Her mind raced, replaying every moment she had spent with Ethan. The hesitant smiles, the vulnerable confessions, the hope that had flickered in his eyes. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. When she arrived, the hospital was a cold maze of hallways and sterile lights. She found Henry pacing outside the ICU, looking older and more fragile than she had ever seen him. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, all the hostility and suspicion between them fell away. He looked at her with a mix of guilt, pain, and desperate hope. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking. It's bad. I need to see him," she said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her insides. Henry nodded, stepping aside. He didn't argue, didn't try to keep her away. He simply watched as she walked through the doors, his own heart breaking. Ethan lay motionless, tubes and monitors surrounding him. His face was pale, his body broken. Sarah approached slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She took his hand, careful not to disturb the wires and bandages. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm here. I'm so sorry." There was no response, just the steady beep of the heart monitor. Sarah sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. She talked to him for hours. About Max, about the memories they had shared, about the future she hoped they could still have. She pleaded with him to fight, to come back to her. In the hallway, Henry listened, guilt and regret weighing him down. He realized that Sarah had never been the enemy. She had been the bridge he had torn down. Watching her fight for his son's life made him see how blind he had been, how fear had twisted his judgment. If Ethan survived, Henry vowed he would make things right. He would be the father his son needed, and he would start by letting Sarah stay, by letting her help heal what had been broken. But for now, all they could do was wait. The hours stretched into days, each one a test of endurance and faith. Ethan remained in critical condition, his body fighting for every breath. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but warned that his recovery would be long and fraught with uncertainty. Every morning, Sarah sat by his side, speaking to him, hoping her voice would reach him wherever he was. She told him about Max's silly jokes, about the stories they had shared, and about all the things she believed he still had to look forward to. She held his hand as if her touch alone could tether him to life. Henry spent most of his time outside the room, wrestling with a guilt that had long since become familiar, but now cut deeper than ever before. He had driven Sarah away, thinking it was best for Ethan. Instead, it had pushed his son to the brink. Each memory of their strained relationship haunted him. Every harsh word, every cold dismissal. He paced the hallways, replaying the choices he'd made, each one a stone on the scale of his failure. On the third day, Henry finally gathered the courage to step into Ethan's room. Sarah was there, as always, exhaustion etched into her face, but determination burning in her eyes. She barely acknowledged Henry at first, her attention fixed on Ethan. Henry approached slowly, feeling like an intruder. He cleared his throat, but his voice came out strained. "How is he?" Sarah didn't look at him. "The same." Her words were clipped, not out of anger, but out of weariness. "The doctors say he's stable, but it's too soon to know if he'll wake up." Henry moved closer, the weight of his regret pressing down on him. "I was wrong, Sarah. About you, about everything." His voice trembled, raw with emotion. "I thought I was protecting him, but I was blind." Finally, she turned to him, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "Do you think this makes it right?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce. "You pushed him away. You pushed both of us away." Henry nodded, unable to argue. "I know," he whispered. "I know, and I can never undo it. But I need to try to make things right. If he wakes up, when he wakes up," he paused, his voice breaking. "He needs you, and I'll make sure you're there." "Don't say it if you don't mean it," Sarah warned, tears glistening in her eyes. "Because if you shut me out again, it'll destroy him." Henry met her gaze, his own eyes filled with tears. "I won't. I swear it." There was no forgiveness in Sarah's expression, only a cautious hope. For now, it was enough. They stood together in the silence of the room, united by their shared guilt and desperate hope for Ethan's recovery. The days blurred together. Henry remained at the hospital, refusing to leave. He spoke with doctors, arranged for specialists, and even reached out to contacts he hadn't used in years to ensure Ethan had the best care possible. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't acting as the powerful businessman or the distant father. He was simply a parent terrified of losing his child. Meanwhile, Sarah kept vigil by Ethan's side. She slept in short bursts, afraid to be too far from him. When she was too exhausted to stay awake, Henry would take her place, his presence awkward but genuine. In those quiet hours, he often found himself speaking to Ethan, apologizing for every mistake, every missed opportunity. "I should have listened to you," he said one night, his voice cracking. "I thought I knew what was best. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was push you away." As days turned into weeks, small signs of improvement began to emerge. Ethan's vital signs stabilized, and the swelling in his brain decreased. The doctors gradually reduced his sedation, preparing for the possibility that he might wake. Hope, fragile but persistent, filled the air. One afternoon, as Sarah read aloud from one of Ethan's favorite books, his hand twitched. She stopped mid-sentence, her breath catching. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. She squeezed his hand gently. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. It was a small movement, but it was enough to send a surge of hope through the room. Henry, who had been standing by the window, turned at the sound of Sarah's voice. He rushed to the bedside, his heart pounding. "Ethan?" Slowly, painfully, Ethan's eyes opened. He blinked, disoriented, his gaze unfocused. But he was awake. Sarah's tears fell freely as she leaned closer. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're going to be okay." Ethan's lips parted, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Sarah?" His gaze shifted, landing on his father. Confusion and pain flickered in his eyes. "Dad?" Henry stepped forward, his throat tight. "I'm here, Ethan. I'm here." He wanted to say more, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. But he held back, knowing this wasn't the time. For now, all that mattered was that Ethan was awake. The road to recovery was slow and arduous. Ethan struggled with physical therapy, pain, and the emotional scars that lingered. But he wasn't alone. Sarah and Henry stood by him every step of the way, their fractured relationships slowly mending. It wasn't easy. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, and old wounds didn't heal without leaving scars, but they were trying. Henry, true to his word, supported Sarah's presence. He went beyond that, even inviting her and Max to spend time at the mansion. He wanted Ethan to have a support system that wasn't contingent on his own flawed attempts at fatherhood. Slowly, he learned to listen, to both Ethan and Sarah, and to accept his own failings without letting them paralyze him. One evening, as the three of them sat together in the garden, Ethan turned to his father. "Why now?" he asked quietly. "Why are you trying so hard?" Henry looked at him, the weight of his regret evident in his eyes. "Because I don't want to lose you again," he said simply. "I can't change the past, but I want to be better. For you. For us." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing his father's words. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden mending of every broken piece. But there was understanding, and that was a start. Sarah watched the exchange, hope blooming in her chest. They had a long way to go, but they were moving forward together. She reached for Ethan's hand, and he held on tightly. In that moment, they all knew that healing was possible, if they were willing to fight for it. The weeks that followed Ethan's return home were a blur of pain, progress, and quiet moments of hope. The mansion, once a place of silence and suppressed emotions, now hummed with new energy. Ethan's recovery was slow, marked by grueling physical therapy sessions and the emotional weight of his near-death experience. But this time, he wasn't alone. Sarah was there, always, her steady presence anchoring him. Henry, too, surprised everyone by stepping into the role of caregiver with a quiet determination that spoke more than words ever could. One evening, as the setting sun cast a warm glow over the garden, Ethan sat on a bench, watching Max chase fireflies. His movements were still stiff, but each step he took without pain felt like a victory. Sarah joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to him, and they sat in companionable silence, listening to the distant laughter of a carefree child. "He's got so much energy," Ethan said, a small smile playing at his lips. "I don't know how you keep up." Sarah laughed softly, her eyes never leaving Max. "Most days, I don't. He wears me out, but it's worth it." Ethan's expression grew somber. "You know, I never really understood how much you had to fight. For him, for yourself. I thought I had it hard, but..." He shook his head. "I didn't see it." "You've been fighting your own battles, Ethan," Sarah said gently. "Pain is pain. It doesn't have to be compared." They fell silent again. But this time the quiet felt different. Less heavy, more healing. It was a silence filled with the understanding they had earned through shared struggles and unspoken words. Inside, Henry watched from the window. He had spent so many years looking out at the estate, seeing the grounds as an extension of his power and legacy. Now, he saw them as a place for his son's recovery, for laughter and connection. He had spent too long trying to control everything, building walls to keep his pain hidden. But those walls had only isolated him from the people he loved most. Determined to do better, Henry approached the garden. He moved slowly, as if unsure of his welcome. Sarah noticed him first and offered a small smile, encouraging him to join them. He sat beside Ethan, who glanced at him with wary eyes. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the echoes of their fractured past hanging between them. "I used to come here with your mother," Henry said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, rough with emotion. "She loved this garden, said it was the heart of the house." Ethan looked away, his jaw tight. "I don't remember much about her," he admitted, his voice raw. "Just bits and pieces." Henry nodded slowly. "I know, and I'm sorry for that." He took a deep breath, willing himself to keep going. "I should have done better. I should have been there for you. I can't change that, but I want to be better now." Ethan's hands clenched in his lap, and for a moment, Sarah feared he would shut down. But then he nodded, a small, tentative motion. "I'm not ready to forgive everything," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to try." Relief washed over Henry, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. "That's all I ask." They sat together, the three of them, as Max continued to chase fireflies. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden mending of every hurt, but there was a willingness to try, to build something better from the ashes of what had been broken. Over the next few months, their lives intertwined in new ways. Sarah and Max moved into a small cottage on the estate grounds, at Henry's insistence. It gave her space and independence, but also kept her close enough to be part of Ethan's recovery. Henry stepped back from his work to focus on his family, learning to let go of the need to control everything. He joined Ethan in therapy sessions, listened to his son's fears, and shared his own. They built trust slowly, one fragile step at a time. Sarah and Ethan's bond deepened. What had begun as a friendship grew into something neither of them had expected. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Ethan stopped and turned to her. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." "You don't have to thank me," Sarah replied, smiling softly. "I'm exactly where I want to be." He took her hand, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the future wasn't just an empty promise. They leaned into each other, the warmth of their connection easing the scars of the past. One crisp autumn morning, as leaves fell in bursts of red and gold, Henry gathered everyone in the main hall. The house, once cold and empty, was now filled with light. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady but hopeful. "It's time we make some changes around here. Together." He spoke of new beginnings, of opening the estate to the community, creating spaces for art and learning, and building something that reflected their new path forward. Sarah and Ethan exchanged glances, surprise and pride lighting their faces. This was a Henry they hadn't seen before, a man willing to let go of the past and build something meaningful. As they began to discuss plans, laughter and conversation filled the room. It wasn't perfect. There were still scars, still moments of doubt, but it was real. They were healing together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Sarah stood hand in hand, watching Max chase fireflies in the garden. Henry joined them, a quiet smile on his face. For the first time in a long time, the future felt like a place they could walk toward together, not free of pain, but full of promise. They had been broken, all of them, but they were learning to build something new. Together, they would create a home filled not with wealth or power, but with love, hope, and the courage to keep going, even when it seemed impossible.